Hi, can everyone hear me? Sorry, we have some technical difficulties. Can I get a thumbs up in the chat room? Yes, hallelujah, we're in. Good job. Sorry, everyone, we have a little technical. Yes, I'm loving it. Everyone is on live. So yeah, welcome to Fiveable. Sorry, we had some problems logging in with Crowdcast. So we had to restart and everything. Okay, so can anyone tell me where they're coming from tonight? What states? What schools? Dallas, Texas. I love it. California. Okay, all across the USA. That's cool. Yep. Okay. Okay, can anyone tell me how do they feel about the DBQ? Did you guys hear that there's going to be a DBQ? So yeah, we just received message like about an hour ago from Trevor Packer, and it's going to be a 45-minute exam, as you already know, and it's going to be a DBQ, but instead of 7 questions, it's going to be 5 questions. So how about that? So we put a poll on the bottom. You can tell me your reaction or write a little bit about it in the chat. It's very, very interesting. Yeah, okay, so kind of a shocking face. Anyone else? Is anybody happy with that? All right, so let me try to share my slides. There's a lot of technical difficulties going on tonight. Let's see. No, sorry, 1 second. So tonight's stream, while I set this up, is going to be about Martin Luther and the Reformation, and I'm hoping to, there we go, now I got it. Martin Luther and the Reformation, which interestingly enough is something that keeps on popping a lot in the exams. So again, I'm not guaranteeing that this will be the DBQ, but it's interesting that there's always been something about the Reformation in the exam. So, I mean, it's a very important topic. So you're doing a good job by joining this stream tonight. So let's go ahead and just review a little bit about Martin Luther and the Reformation, a very important topic. And again, if you're new to Fiveable, Fiveable's got a whole list of topics for a variety of APs. So specifically, history is done on Thursday. There's AP World, US, and Europe. So check the other streams if you're planning in the future taking out any APs. Now, specifically for AP Euro, we're just going backwards now because we're only covering period 1 to 7. So we're going backwards and starting to review. So future reviews that I will cover in the streams, we'll do also the English and French Revolution next week. Kind of a broad overview about both of these revolutions and maybe trying to find a connection between the English and the French Revolution. A week later, I'm going to do a stream about Mannerism and Baroque art. If we might get something about the Counter-Reformation, that context. So that's a big topic relating to that too. If we get some paintings in the DBQ, that can be interesting. The next day, we also are going to have a Q&A session. So that's going to be open more to questions to people to join us in if they have any specific question about the exam format or any historical context knowledge. And on a week later, we're going to have like a review about the rise of fascism, which is not in the exam. That's one of the bonus sections for anyone who's interested in that. So remember, think Fiveable, follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So let's get into it. So in tonight's stream, we're going to talk about the causes of the Reformation. You might get a causation question. What caused the Reformation? Many interesting answers to that. We're going to talk about specifically the guy who started the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. So he's a person you might want to know a little bit more details than any other reformer because he started it. We'll talk about Lutheran theology. What is the foundation of Martin Luther, how he came about with his theory that kind of influenced all the other streams of Protestant sects to this day. We'll talk about War of Religion, which is a very outcome, if you want, effects of Martin Luther. And then we'll talk about the other reformer that is mentioned in the concept outline, and that's John Calvin. So there are many, many reformers, but I'm picking to talk tonight about Luther and Calvin specifically because they're the two that are mentioned in the concept outline. So again, Reformation and the AP exam, what are we looking for? So it seems like if anyone who's been teaching AP or everyone who's following AP exam for the last 5 or something years, it seems like every year there's always some essay questions about the Reformation. There used to be an SAQ. One more time, it was like we had a 30 Years' War question a few years ago. So it's a good thing to, if you're going to study 7 periods, I would definitely focus a little bit about the Reformation. Now it's only just one question, so it kind of narrows it down. But it's always something good to talk about. Now, specifically, where do we need to focus? In the key concept outline, it specifically states that the Reformers are Luther and John Calvin, and they criticize the abuses of the Catholic Church, and kind of like also the effects of their preaching and what they led to. Is some example that you might want to use are kind of like the Anabaptists and kind of like the revolutions of the Peasant Wars, and eventually the religious wars that kind of basically started up from that point on up to like 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. So that's kind of like a big overview of what we're going to do or talk about, but specifically Calvin and Luther is what we're going to talk about. Okay, so and again, if you have any question, drop it in the bottom in the question option, and throughout the stream I'll try to stop for any questions. Okay, so let's start in the beginning. Let's talk about the church on the eve of the Reformation. So again, how did the Catholic Church, what was its situation just before Luther arrives in the scene and hangs in his famous 95 Thesis? So big picture overview is that you might have studied in the beginning of the year, if you remember. I don't know if your teacher taught you about the Middle Ages. Did anyone study about the Middle Ages in the beginning of the year? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Anyone? So some teachers, no. So I mean, some teachers want to go straight into the outline and they don't want to give background, but it's good to have a little bit background to understand where Luther comes from. The exam starts at 1450, just a little. Yeah, most teachers just touch just a little bit about it, but the exam starts at 1450. And the big idea that we want to remember is that the Catholic Church, basically since the collapse of the Roman Empire, in the 5th century, the Catholic Church was kind of like the only functioning body in Europe. So it was called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, a period of like, kind of like everything goes, outlaws, and the empire was gone one day and everything that everyone knew, just disappeared. So the Catholic Church kind of stepped in and kind of filled up the vacuum. For the next 1,000 years, they were probably the most important institution in Europe. And they were kind of involved in every aspect of life for the next thousands of the years. So I gave here like a couple of examples just to see the power of the Catholic Church. One example is in education, that the church basically controlled almost most of the educational system in Western Europe. So all of those universities that you're hearing that's starting to pop up in Italy in the 12th century, most of them were owned by the church, and most of the teachers were priests. Martin Luther was also a college professor, as we're going to study later on. Libraries was usually held in monasteries. All the books that were published usually were written by the church before the printing press. So education is kind of like one example of how the church had a big monopoly on one aspect. Another aspect of their control is the health system. The church basically was responsible for social work and welfare of the people, and kind of like the first hospitals, not a real hospital, but kind of like isolating people, was actually also created by the Catholic Church. And finally, the most important thing, of course, for most European is salvation. If you wanted to be saved, in the Dark Ages, where the church was a lot of time was known as the only salvation. The only way to get to heaven is through the church. And it's during those 1,000 years from the collapse of the Roman Empire until Luther appears into the scene that this is where they kind of developed their 7 sacrament system, which again are not necessarily taught specifically in the Bible. They just kind of like a few of them they just took and basically created these 7 sacraments, which are kind of like basically like hoses to salvation. So if you experience these 7 sacraments, your chances of getting into heaven are higher. That's at least what the church is teaching. Anyone knows any of these 7 sacraments? 1 or 2 examples you might know. It's also interesting because Luther cancels 5 of them and just leave 2. So that's interesting why he decided to change some of these sacraments. So I'm not getting some options on sacraments here. Yes, communion is an option of a sacrament. So anytime you get communion, that's what people are going with. You're feeling like that's one of those things like you're giving you closer to heaven. So that's one option for that. So it could be baptism is a sacrament, communion is a sacrament, getting married is a sacrament. That's why you cannot get a divorce because you can't break a sacrament. Confession is a sacrament. The last rites just before you die, confessing all your sins, that's a sacrament. Becoming a priest also is a sacrament. So these are penance, yes. So like confessing, talking about. So anyway, these 7 sacraments were basically created during that time, and the church teaches that these are the ways to get salvation. That's what they teach. Okay, so basically, big picture, the Catholic Church, to summarize, for 1,000 years was one of the most important institutions, probably the only one functioning in Europe when Luther comes into the scene. So if the church was the only functioning institution and they were the most successful institution, why was there a Reformation? Why there was causes for basically somebody to revolt against it? So there are many, many causes, and again, different historians pick different things. One thing that most historians will, of course, agree on, there was a lot of corruption in the church. The popes basically started to live like little kings. They put taxes. Everyone had to pay taxes for the church, and church officials, Pope and his friends, basically lived like life of princes, not really as like Erasmus later criticizing them, not really living like the way the apostle lived. Another example is something Luther specifically got attached in his criticism of the church early on is indulgences, which are basically, anyone studied indulgences? What's an indulgence? Or what does indulgence guarantee? So indulgences are basically you buy a document from the church and they basically guarantee with this document that all your sins are basically forgiven. So you're kind of like going in an express train into heaven. So you buy a document and in return you're going into heaven. And that's something that really, really was outrageous to Luther. So that's another big cause for the Reformation. Anti-clericalism. There was a lot of ignorance with the clerics. A lot of them couldn't read Latin. A lot of them couldn't teach correctly. So there was a lot of hatred towards monks and priests. A lot of people were upset with them. And also there was a problem of absenteeism. A lot of them did not even attend or worked in the location where they were supposed to. So you had a lot of bishops that never came to ceremonies or priests who never showed up. So there was a lot of hatred developing towards priests and monks. And interestingly enough, with many of the religious wars, the revolution, many of them got attacked. They were the first one to get attacked. So it's not a coincidence that they're going into the monasteries and attacking priests. And also, if you study the Renaissance, you can connect to the Renaissance. That's another interesting, if you study Renaissance and Reformation, find the connection between them, is humanism, the study of people, putting the focus more on people and less on the Bible. Humanists like Erasmus started to write more questions and starting to question the tradition of the church. And again, Erasmus is seen a lot of time kind of like the person that laid the egg, and Luther is like the one who hatched it, basically. But Erasmus was not interested in breaking the Catholic Church, but he also started criticizing the church and its practices in his famous book, The Praise of Folly. So that's another good outside information if you want to remember for the exam, Erasmus and The Praise of Folly. So that's a little bit background to what happens before we get into the scene and we get into Martin Luther. Any questions up till now? All right, good. So let's continue. So let's talk about who was Martin Luther. What do we know about him? We actually know a lot about him. How do we know so much information about him? He actually wrote a lot of details throughout his life. He kept a journal and really expressed everything. So you can actually really do a good, if you're a shrink, you probably can do a great analysis. I think actually somebody wrote a book, like a shrink perspective on an analysis of Martin Luther. I don't remember the name right now. But anyway, what do we know a little bit about him, or the basic stuff that we need to know? That he was born in Saxony in Germany, that he was an Augustine monk. Before all of this, he was also a university professor. He was a very smart intellectual person. His major document is the 95 Thesis that basically started the Protestant Reformation. And from that, basically a plethora of like hundreds of other reform Protestant movements started to erupt. So he's the first one to start the Protestant Reformation. Before him, there's only one Catholic church. Once he starts to open up criticism to the church, many variety of sects are basically breaking up, and that's what we have today. You know, hundreds of different sects of Christianity, Quakers, Shakers, Mormons, all these things, they all start from Luther. Because before that, there's only one church, or the claim is there's only one salvation, and that's inside the church. Okay, so that's big picture about Martin Luther to set it up. So now let's go a little bit more deeper into his biography, because he's kind of an important figure in the context of the Protestant Reformation, because everything basically starts from him, and we need to go deeper to understand what exactly was his criticism against the church, and was it valid or not, or where is it coming from? So his basic biography is, we know that he was born in, again, there's still no country called Germany. There's little principality. So he was born in Saxony, and he graduated from the University of Erfurt. And his father actually built on him being the smart one, that he's going to be a successful lawyer. So they put a lot of emphasis on his education and hoping that he's going to be a very successful lawyer. And we know by his writing that his father was a very, very difficult man. But then as something happened to him, he recalls telling the story that one day, riding from college on the way home, there was a big storm, there was a thunder, and he got really, really scared. And he said, like, help me, Saint Anne, if you save me, I will become a monk. It's kind of like giving, like making an oath. And he was saved, and the next day he took it seriously and basically said that he's going to leave his college education and become a monk. And he didn't pick an easy, there were many, many variety of monasteries that he could have chosen. He probably picked the hardest one, which is becoming an Augustine monk. They were like really, really the hardcore organization. And eventually he got ordained as a priest in 1507. And we also know that he received a PhD in theology from Wittenberg University. And basically for the rest of his life, he was teaching religion. Now, all of this basically just goes back to the fact that Luther throughout his life was a very, very concerned person. He's kind of a reflection for the society of the late Middle Ages. People are constantly fearful that they're sinful and that they're not meeting God's demand and that they're going to go to hell. That's the kind of the mindset of most Europeans and most religious people during that time, that man is sinful and there's no way to stop that. Now, he constantly thought about what is the best way for me, like not to be sinful. So the church taught that the best way is probably to become a priest or a monk, and he did it, but he still was very, very fearful. So he was constantly reading and even physically punishing himself just to find ways to find salvation, but he was not finding it. And then the big turning point, if you want, for his whole of his studying and reading basically is going through studying the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament and reading a certain passage of St. Paul quoting from the Old Testament. He found a line that really, really like inspired him. The line kind of loosely translates to like the just shall live in faith, something like that, along those lines. So from that line, that was his big aha moment, that basically he came from that to the foundation of his theology teaching, which is justification comes through faith. So you got a free gift from God, and human being, basically, if they connect to that, and if they justify themselves in front of God, that they can live their life and that they will find salvation. So that's a very, very big turning point, that this is where we come justification by faith. So meaning you don't need to do all these elaborate ceremonies. You don't need to see a priest and confess for all your sin. You just need to have faith. And if you have faith, you might get salvation. That's a huge, huge breakthrough from all the teaching of the Catholic Church. Everything that they taught, he basically flipped it with that key concept of his teaching of justification by faith. And the thing that specifically started all of his anger with the church and started his rebellion, the date, if you want one date for the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the date will probably be October 31st, 1517. That's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And on that specific day, what he did is he basically took his famous 95 Thesis and he basically nailed them to the door in the church in Wittenberg. Anyone knows what was in the 95 Thesis? What did he actually write in the 95 Thesis? Anyone? Did anyone study 95 Thesis? Did anyone want to get it as a primary document in class? No? All right. So good thing that you're coming into here in class. You might get this as a primary source. So the 95 Theses mainly are focused on the idea of indulgences. Luther basically criticized this whole idea of that you kind of like that you sell people a document and they're going to get salvation and get to heaven. He doesn't really like that idea. He thinks God is like an accountant and he's going to sit upstairs and basically count how many sins you did and then you're going to go to hell, or you bought a document so now you're not going to go to hell. So Luther criticized the Catholic Church and saying God is not an accountant. And he kind of basically undermines this whole idea of penance that doesn't really make sense about confessing your sins. And then he also undermines where's the power of the Pope. So basically kind of like going against the basic teaching of the Catholic Church, but specifically focusing on indulgences. Now, he just, nailed them on that specific wall, but we don't know exactly who, but they were made copies of this, and they were translated also to the native German language, because he wrote in Latin. And the papacy responded once they started to get published very quickly. He was actually surprised. He had no idea they're going to get published, and so many copies are going to get distributed throughout Germany and later on in Europe. Anyone knows how so many of these documents got? How did they make so many copies so quickly all of a sudden? What was a big game changer? The printing press. There you go. So now you have a game changer. It's a great thing that you might need to know if you talk about the Reformation. One of the biggest, you might just get even a question just about the printing press, its influence. So the printing press basically is kind of like the equivalent today of like the internet, like the revolution. So from people just sitting in churches and like writing a book. So one book will, like a book will take you, I don't know, like a year or 2 years to write down, like God forbid you're going to make a spelling mistake. Now you can basically put it, and now you can make as many copies as you want once you set up the basic foundation in that. So the printing press is a huge, huge transformation. So if you might also recall that Johannes Gutenberg is the person that created the printing press. I say created because technically the Chinese already invented the printing press in like in the 11th century, but they had thousands of images. We have a very easy language. You just plug a few letters. So basically you plug the letters in the bottom, as you can see, you put the paper on top, and then it's kind of like, it's like a wine pressing machine, and you print it down. So you can make as many copies as you want. So the the documents that Luther criticized the church with got distributed throughout the throughout Europe. And again, historically, if you published a book against the church, it will be very easy. You publish 1 or 2 books. All they need to do is burn those books or put them under a lock and key in a monastery, and that will be the end. But with the printing press, it's like thousands of documents, so the church cannot stop. And that basically started a big debate, basically erupted in all across Europe about the writing of Martin Luther. And once the church basically saw the distribution of these documents, they responded and condemned Luther, and basically they ordered all of his books to be burned. But again, it's not really possible or doable because there's so many. And they also gave him a couple of months, and if not, he's going to be excommunicated. Anyone knows what excommunication means? What's excommunication? Why is that a big threat? Kicked out of the church. That's right. So you basically, like, excommunication means no communion for you. Basically, you get kicked out of the church, and that will probably be like the worst possible thing, for a religious person, for a Catholic person, like that. They'll be like, I'm not getting sacraments. I'm going to go to burn in hell. But Luther himself actually is not really impressed by this excommunication as many people were before, and we actually even they write a big papal bull, which is like an official document that he gets excommunicated, and he and his followers, they just burn that document, so they don't really take it as seriously. So things move very, very quickly after that writing. Okay, so is there any questions up till now? If I'm going fast, let me know. I'm not seeing the questions in the bottom here, so let's continue. So let's talk a little bit about Luther's theology. That's another interesting question, or something that they might ask you. What does he believe in? So he's basically going against the teaching of the Catholic Church, but what does he stand for? And again, he basically started with justification by faith. That was the foundation of his belief. But later on, as the year progressed, he kind of sat down and kind of had to put like his own belief system. You're saying the Catholic Church is wrong? Yes, but what do you believe in? So it boiled down to 3 major points. I mean, it boiled down to a lot of points, but to make it easier for class, it boiled down to 3 major points that the foundation of Lutheran theology, there's also the Lutheran Church today that comes after him, is sola fide, Latin for faith alone, sola scriptura, which means scripture alone, and sola gratia, which means grace alone. So this is the foundation of what he believes in. So let's go over point by point. First one we already talked about, sola fide, is by faith alone. So you cannot gain God's favor by confessing to a priest or doing all these like hard labor to like show that how much you love God. You get it directly from God. If you have faith, then you will get salvation. Okay, so that's the way you do it. Catholic Church always taught you do the good deeds, you do your sacraments, you repent for your sins. That's how you get salvation. Luther saying, you do it by having faith. That's how you get it. The other major point is sola scriptura, and that's very, very important, very, very revolutionary to an extent. It basically said that the church, again, the church developed all these 7 sacraments and all these traditions throughout the Middle Ages. He's going to go very, very specific and said, sola scriptura, anything that you're going to claim has to be in the Bible. If something is not mentioned in the Bible, then you can't have it, okay? So, for example, if he looks outside and he sees the Catholic Church has 7 sacraments, he's saying, well, 5 of them I don't find in the Bible. So that's why he's going to leave only 2 sacraments. Baptism is mentioned in the Bible. Jesus gets baptized. And the Lord's Supper, when Jesus says, eat, this is my body, or drink, this is my blood, that's also mentioned in the Bible. So he's leaving 2 sacraments and kicking out 5. Some Lutheran church today have 3. It's kind of debated. But originally, he actually only had 2. If you Google it and look something else, don't sue me for that one, because some claim it was 3, but originally there was 2. Anyway, so 2 sacraments. Most Protestants usually today only have 2, not 3. So sola scriptura, to finish it up, if it's not in the Bible, you can't claim it. And I mean, that's also open to debate. Do you celebrate Christmas? It's not really mentioned. A lot of things were created, and some Christians are like, take it really, really hardcore, and some of them are like, are playing a little bit loose with that. But he claimed if it's not in the Bible, then you can't do it. Finally, sola gratia, grace alone. Salvation comes from God's grace alone. Okay? And there was all this belief system that's important, what he also comes from that to priesthood of all believers. There was a belief inside the Catholic Church that the society is divided into two parts. There's like lay people, regular people, and then there's like a higher level of people, and that's the priests and the monks and the church. So people on the top have a higher chances of getting into heaven. And that's why, like, a priest can never get fired from his job because he got a sacrament, or you cannot break wedding vows because that's a sacrament. Luther is saying being a priest, being a monk, that's not giving you any special treatment. Priest of all believers, everyone is exactly on the same level playing field. And that's a very attractive message for a lot of regular Europeans during that time, if you ask why Luther is so attractive to so many people. That's why also in the Protestant church or in the Lutheran church, you're known as a pastor. And if you're doing a bad job, they can fire you. It's just a job. There's nothing special about that. So in the Catholic Church, a priest or a monk, somebody who's very, very high and elevated. And the Protestant church is just a job, like being a teacher, like something I'm doing. So if you're not good, they'll get somebody else. It's not like, oh, I have a sacrament, so you can never get rid of me. So that's another important thing, that God's grace, his salvation comes from God's grace alone. Okay, so that's the foundation of his teaching, and there's many other things that come about it. Another important point you might want to know is celibacy. That's another cause of the Reformation, can be that the Catholic Church also during the Middle Ages created the whole idea of celibacy was created around the 12th century, that monks and priests kind of dedicate themselves to God, and they're not going to get married and not have kids, or nuns is kind of a similar thing. And Luther basically says, like, again, sola scriptura, he can't find any justification for that in the Bible. There's no need for that. So that's why he and many of his followers, they, are getting married, and sometimes getting married to former nuns. So it's kind of like a complete revolution. Luther and his wife kind of become like the role model of, like, former, she was a nun, he was a priest, a monk, and they get married. So it's an example of changing their ways. Their picture is kind of like the new Protestant family. Okay, so that's kind of like the revolution, and that's what he stands for. Any questions up till now? And again, I'm giving a lot of information because we're kind of more in review mood before the exam. All right, questions. Would Luther ideas have spread so widely without the printing press? I mean, great question. That's something that you might want to figure out yourself. But if you ask me specifically, probably if it wasn't for the printing press, I'm kind of guessing that he'll probably have a more difficult time for his ideas to spread. And the thing is, you also, if you want to remember a little bit big picture, there were some reformers before Luther that criticized the church, like Jan Hus or Wycliffe in England. So there were people who criticized the church before it did things like that. But many of these people, if they had a few books, they burned them very quickly. And in some cases, they actually, like Jan Hus, they actually even burned himself. They burned him. So like his movements got suppressed by the church itself. But luckily for Luther, things will work a little bit better for him, mainly to the printing press, and also the fact that he had a good, the principality where he lived, he had a very protective prince that actually protected him. So chronologically, if we're going back to what happens after the 95 Thesis and Luther writing against the church, so the 95 Thesis, the date, if you want to remember it for the test, to write it down, maybe that'll impress some reader, October 31st, 1517. I tell my students, like, that's probably one of the 3 dates, the only 3 dates you might want to know for the exam. So after the 95 Thesis that he hangs them over, basically the revolution basically starts. Luther and his followers, they take off the robes, they leave the monasteries, they go and preach, they don't care about excommunication. So it's like kind of like a revolution happening. And they spread throughout what is known as the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire famously said wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, it was definitely not an empire, but they called it at least. So Luther was, a few years later, he was asked to appear before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Now, Charles V is also a very important figure. If you're taking notes, write his name down. He's definitely like one of the most important people during that time, because he's going to rule for like around 30 years, and many things are relating to him. Though the wars that will start are very important. For as far as you need to know about him, he's a Habsburg, big chin, and he just got he just literally got into power when the whole thing started. He was only 19 years old, and he's also a very firm Catholic. He has a lot of faith, and he really hates the whole Luther thing. So Luther was invited to the Diet in Worms, which was this big conference of like the emperor with other princes of that time all throughout the Holy Roman Empire. They came over, and Luther basically came out of hiding. He came to this conference, and in that conference, it was famously said that Luther basically stood up his ground, as you can see in a lot of famous paintings, and said to have said, here I stand, I cannot do other. That's what he was famously said for. We don't know if he actually said that. But during the meeting, they asked him to recant his text, what he wrote. He refused to do that. We know that for a fact. And at the end of the convention, I mean, it's kind of an example of freedom of speech. A man stands for something, high chance of being killed. At the end of the meeting, he's declared an outlaw. And basically they say anyone who's going to kill him like is doing God's work. So Luther was probably very close to being killed. But luckily for him, he lived in a principality where his prince was named Frederick the Wise, or also Fredericks of Saxony, or Frederick III. There's like 5 names for you to pick if you go blind in the test. But anyway, Frederick actually likes the messages of Luther and decide basically to protect Luther. He also brought Luther to this convention with the guarantee that Luther were not going to be killed, because Jan Hus 100 years before also had a guarantee when he went to a conference that nothing bad will happen to him, and he still got burned. But in Luther's case, there was a guarantee. Now, on the way back from the conference, when they could have killed Luther, Frederick actually sends people to abduct Luther and basically kind of put him in the witness protection program. So that performance that he gave actually even made the Protestant message even stronger and louder across the Holy Roman Empire, that here stands somebody that has principalities and he is not going to back down for the Catholic Church that a lot of people had issue with, and he spoke about it. Okay, and that basically starts up what will become little religious wars or peasant revolts spreading all across Europe because of Luther's message. So Luther's message of anti-clerical message, speaking against the priests, the monks, the Catholic Church, basically got a lot of regular people to fire it up, to basically say, you know, like justification by faith sounds good to me. Who needs the church? So they basically went and started attacking churches, and they also started to attack the lords, whoever was like running the principality where they lived. And so we got a full-blown revolution going on. And again, they plundered monasteries. Some of them like broke images of the church. That's another criticism that some of the Protestant reformers were starting to talk about. Some of them were serfs. They were connected to the land. So they believed like, I don't need to pay taxes anymore. I need to work for this person anymore. But interestingly enough, a lot of these people got inspired by Luther, but Luther was not supportive of this revolution. So both of the princes that followed Martin Luther and the Catholic princes, both of them decided that this revolution is bad business. It doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Lutheran. So to put down the peasant revolt, both of them basically sent in their soldiers and executed, we're assuming around or above 100,000 people got killed. With the priests, by the way, encourage him to do that. The priests were very encouraging them to kill all these antichrists, as they called them, those people being sinful. They felt like nothing wrong with killing them. Now, interestingly enough, all of this started because of Martin Luther. But is Luther supporting these people? to the surprise of a lot of people, he's actually not going to support them. And he wrote, I mean, he actually wrote a lot of documents. He wrote a specific document against what he called the mob of the peasant. And he specifically wrote that they're faithless, called them a lot of names, but going to actually what needs to happen to them, he wrote that they should be smashed, stabbed in secret or openly by anyone who can, just to kill them, like what he said, like a rabid dog. So that was like shocking to a lot of people. So that's the kind of contradiction of Luther. A lot of people, well, you inspired us to go into a revolution, and now you're telling us, no, your revolution is wrong. So Luther kind of like probably was thinking about the effects of his writing or what actually happened that has gone further than what he was interested. And Luther, basically also working up his theology, basically claimed that rulers were appointed by God, and they're kind of like doing God's work. So you must obey your rulers. So yes, you can go against the Catholic Church, but you cannot go against the ruler itself, because he is doing God's work. Any job that any person is doing, basically from the Bible, he's getting is doing God's work. So it's kind of like mixing politics. What he said, basically mixing politics and religion is like the devil's work. You're not supposed to do these. These are two separate things, which we're going to go to later on to Calvin. Calvin had a different viewpoint on that. So there was a lot of disappointment from him and his responses from that. Now, the peasant revolt was just one aspect of that, but that started in Germany, but you have basically more radical wings even than the peasant revolt. Peasant just wanted no taxes, and they wanted to overthrow their lords. But then you have more radical wings of the Protestant. If everyone can interpret the Bibles the way they see it, as Luther said, sola scriptura, then anyone can open the Bible and find passages, and they can basically practice based upon that. So some communities basically said, maybe pointing to kind of the teaching of Jesus, maybe we need to abolish private property, or maybe Jesus it's like what they were reading from the Bible, understanding that maybe we can have polygamy. So some people start communities where there is polygamy, and they abolish private property. Very radical communities. And some of them are adopting baptism later in life as adult believers. And that's something new that never existed in the church, because again, they're reading the Bible and they're seeing that Jesus gets baptized as an adult person. So they're saying, oh, I need to get baptized as an adult person too. That insurrection eventually is, again, with both sides, Catholics and Lutheran, they basically surround that center of this group, kind of, which are called later on the Anabaptists, because they're against baptism or later baptism in life. And the city of Munster, they basically put this rebellion down and basically kill everyone inside that city that is practicing all these weird things. If you guys study Voltaire, anyone who studied Voltaire in class? Anyone knows Voltaire, most famous book? So we might do a stream later on about enlightenment, kind of refresh your memory about Voltaire. But Voltaire, one of his most famous books is Candide, and Candide, one of the main characters called John the Anabaptist. So he kind of brought him into, so Anabaptists and what they stood for was too much radical for Luther, for a lot of people. But it just goes to show that once you open up the floodgates, like everyone can just jump in and interpret the Bible. Catholic Church doesn't have monopoly to interpret the Bible anymore. Those Anabaptists later on are going to involved into Mennonites and Amish and kind of like other sect groups. So they might have been suppressed at that point, but their ideas lived on. Now, finally, bigger picture, other than all these small revolutions going on with these small communities trying to live in a certain way, peasants are revolting. Eventually, all of Germany is basically breaking into religious wars between all the princes who are going to stand by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles. All the Catholic princes are in one group. And then you got all the Lutheran princes, all the Protestants on one side. And now we have religious wars from both sides. Now, Luther's message is very, very attractive to a lot of princes. Anyone knows why many princes are joining Luther? What's so attractive about his message? Why is he gaining so much support? Why would princes like Martin Luther? so they can have more power. Yes. One of the most attractive, good answer. One of the most attractive points about Martin Luther is that basically he takes away the power of the Catholic Church and gives it to the monarch. So there's a lot of attraction to the message of Luther. He's basically saying you're doing God's work. They're like, a lot of princes like, sound good to me. I'm doing God's work. You have to listen to me. So it used to be the Catholic Church is like, we have this like absolute power, over salvation, all these sort of things. And now Luther is like, no, the ruler can have all that power. So it's a very attractive message. So some people might join the Protestant groups because they like the power idea. Some might join because they actually believe in what Luther is standing for. So there might be a mixed ideology based upon that. By the way, there was a DBQ a few years ago, and it was about the 30 Years' War. And the question was that people, was the war more based on political or more on religious reasons? So like to make an argument based upon that. And you can kind of see there was actually both. So if you say both, you might get your complexity point. So Charles V was very, very staunch Catholic. He was like, I'm not going to negotiate with this Protestants. So eventually all of his supporters lined up to the Catholic group, and all the Protestants built a military alliance, and that's basically what started the War of Religion in Germany. Later on, you're going to have War of Religion. Sorry, if you studied in France and later on in England. So it's all basically, but it starts in Germany. So basically, almost like we're talking about like 30 years of war finally are finished in 1555 in the Peace of Augsburg. So that's easy to remember, 555. Finally, in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, Charles finally agrees to recognize the Lutheran sect. There's no way to get rid of them. And he permits them to have political authority in their territory. Basically, what comes up from the Peace of Augsburg is that whatever the prince rules, whatever his religion, the people's religion will be the same. So if the prince is Catholic, everyone who lives under him has got to be Catholic. If the prince is Protestant or Lutheran, sorry, that's the only option, everyone under him will live under his option. They're not giving, though, any other sect options. It's either Catholic or Lutheran. We're going to talk in a second about Calvinism is also developed around that time. Calvinists are not allowed any option. And that's another reason why Peace of Augsburg will not be the end of all the religious war. And that's where we're going to have more future religious war after that. And in general terms, also, Germany kind of got divided, or what will become later on Germany. There's still not the German state. That's only going to happen like in 1871. But it's kind of divided into two parts. Well, like the north is kind of more Lutheran. In Central Europe is also, Central Germany is more Lutheran, and the South is Catholic. To this day, actually, it's still kind of like in general term, we can generalize that the South is more Catholic and the North is more Lutheran. And also, this is going to postpone German unification for a long time. This is kind of like, actually, there was an opportunity here to find unity among the Germans. Luther also talked about the German language. He translated the Bible into German, sola scriptura. So he wants people to read the Bible for themselves and take it away from the Catholic Church, which published up to that point a book in Latin. But most people could not read Latin, so Luther was very happy with that. So that's basically, I think, what you need to know about the whole Luther situation. Any questions about Martin Luther up to that point before we go to John Calvin? I know I shoved a lot of information at you, but it's a review. All right, so let's move into John Calvin. Anyone study John Calvin here? All right, so John Calvin is very, very a little. Okay, so definitely need to do more than a little, and good that you are here in this stream. So John Calvin, other than having a cool name, he's not that cool. He was born in France, and he was a lawyer. And also his writing are kind of like showing like they have a very lawyerish style, like very, very didactic on every little point. Now, he studied with some of the best legal minds of that time. And again, the context is the Renaissance. So Renaissance also connects, you might find a connection between the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation thinkers studying, reading more, coming up with ideas, breaking away from the church. If you want to find that connection and elaborate a little bit about that. Now, he basically, again, born a Catholic, found interest in the Protestant Reformation, and he's kind of like second generation. So he's like, after Luther starts to spread his gospel, he appears on the scene like 20 years after Luther basically starts. Now, his main text that he's famous for is the Institution of Christian Religion. That's the book that he wrote in 1536, and basically for the rest of his life, he keeps on re-editing that book. Later on, he got invited to Geneva in what become later on the country of Switzerland. And Geneva, to his followers and Calvinists, is going to be referred to as like the New Jerusalem. This is where all of his followers later on will congregate or come to study the foundation of what will become Calvinism. And later on, we'll talk about all the sect that will come from Calvinism. But Calvin, as opposed to Luther, actually wants the church and the state to act together. He sees like that religious people actually should have more power and they should be in control. While Luther separates them and give all the power to the princes, Calvin actually believes that the church should act with the state. And like the best situation is even for the religious people actually to rule over. Like he ran Geneva by himself. He was basically like almost a dictator of that town. So what is his big teaching? So we said about what Luther's main points are, the three solas. Calvin is bringing two main key concepts that you want to remember. He brings five, but to make it easy and to make it simple, he bringing two key concepts into the table, new things. First of all, he's talking about the idea of predestination that hopefully you studied before. And the other one is the elect. Anyone studied predestination or the elect concept? In U.S. history. Okay, yes. Yeah, so if you're taking APUSH, that connects to that because, APUSH people, the Puritans who came to America were basically like a form of Calvinists. So let's get into predestination. Very, very important. I'm glad you guys are joining this stream if you're missing a lot of this information. So predestination, the church always taught that you act and you make all these things throughout your life, and then God, based upon your good action, will choose to give you salvation or not. Calvin comes into the picture and says, God has already decided. Before you were born, God already decided who's going to be saved or not going to be saved. Huge, huge spoiler alert and shock. People are like, what? So it doesn't matter what you do. Basically, God already decided. So predestination is one of his key concepts. And again, he goes in the Bible and finds a few passages to justify his belief, like that God liked Jacob better than Esau, and when they were in the mom's womb. Why you like Jacob better than Esau? Esau didn't do anything wrong, but he's like, I've decided that I like him better. So predestination is a very important concept. The other one is from everyone that is around, God has chosen a small group and they're called the elect. They're like the chosen one for salvation. And the big question is, how do you know who's going to be saved? So one way that a lot of his followers believe that the way that you might want to see it is hard work, thrift, good moral conduct. Those are the sign that you're one of these elected people. So if somebody is studying APUSH or studied APUSH before, somebody mentioned, I also teach APUSH. I actually put a picture here of Ann Hutchinson, and who was in Massachusetts, and she kind of belonged to this group, and she felt like she's one of those elects, or that God chose her. She actually felt that she can actually even see who are the other elected people, but that's another story. So again, it seems like a very negative viewpoint that God already chose people, so why should I work? But a lot of people found solace in that fact that everyone wants to think that they're, of course, the elected one. So the followers of Calvin kind of spread around Europe, and basically in Scotland, one of his followers, John Knox, basically created the Presbyterian Church that still exists to this day in Scotland. His follower in France were known as the Huguenots. So Huguenots, if you study the War of Religion, they're like French Calvinists. And finally, also the people that came to North America, that if you're studying APUSH, the Puritans that basically ran away from England, or also the Separatists, they're also basically Calvinists. A lot of them you can see them, they wear like dark clothing. They're a lot they're more serious. So that's one way always to compare in paintings. If you see like red is very Catholic, or you see bright colors, that's a lot of time Catholics, kind of like more flashy. We're going to talk about that in art next week in the stream about Baroque or Mannerism. More black colors, it's usually going to be the Calvinists, the Puritans, because they see colors as very, very connection to vanity. So last thing I'm going to mention today also that you might want to know about, that almost like around 150 years ago, 120 years ago, a very famous German sociologist named Max Weber actually studied the foundation of capitalism. And he made a connection between capitalism and Protestantism. He brought basically studying Calvinism and brought that there's a connection between the birth of capitalism, like the United States here, where he did a study, and the connection to Calvin. So he wrote this very, very famous book that you might want to use as outside evidence if you're writing a DBQ in this exam. It was called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In it, basically, he argued that religious ideas such as Calvinism basically brought in the spirits of capitalism. So basically, the thesis is everyone wants to know that they're the elected. How do you prove that you're elected? You work really, really hard. So you don't spend your money. Calvinists, they don't or Puritans, they don't do dancing or drinking. They're hard at work. So if you work super hard, then you become successful. Then you're thinking you're the elected one. So by working so hard, you basically created a capitalist society. So one way to prove that you're one of the elected one is by being successful. Hence, if you're a millionaire today, you're like, God must love me, I'm an elect. If you're poor, you'll be like, God does not love me, I'm not going to be one of the elected. So he made the connection between that and the birth of capitalism. So Ulrich Zwingli is not important for this exam. He's not mentioned in the concept outline. You might want to use him as outside evidence, but again, focus on the people that are mentioned in the exam. Calvin and Luther are the people that you need to know for the Protestant Reformation. Weber is great outside information if you need. So finally, just to compare and contrast, if you want to do that in an essay or DBQ format, between Luther and Calvin, both important Protestant figure, that we know that Luther is from Germany, Calvin is from France. Luther is the first. Calvin comes into the scene like second generation. Luther is the founder of what will become the Lutheran Church, which still exists to this day. Calvin is the founder of what become later on Presbyterian or Huguenots in France. Luther is famous for the 95 Thesis. Calvin is famous for, institution of Christian religion. Power, where power should be held. Luther is saying the state should have the power, the prince should have the power, and Calvin actually said the church, the religious people are the one, kind of like theocracy, the rule of religious people. The key concept of Luther, of course, is sola fide, faith alone, and Calvin comes in and brings us the concept of the elect. The elect are the one who are going to get salvation. So just to finish up, remember to think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. There's a link also here from my book about Qigong. If you guys want to do a little relaxation during this more stressful time, you got to plug something from yourself once in a while, I believe. And let's get into Q&A, questions and answers. Let's see what's left. All right, so any questions? Let's see what we got. All right, so what's the difference between Lutheran and Calvinism? I just did that chart, so I guess that helps you answering that question. But, they both have two sacraments, and I think that's similar. It's just where the power lays. Is the power in the hands of the church? Is the power in the hand of the state? So Luther, it's in the state. Calvin believed that religious people have a higher option. And also the idea of salvation, like you might want to think about Calvin being more radical than Luther. So it's kind of like Luther is Protestant Reformation, breaks away from the church, but he's not that. At the end of the day, Luther is not that of a radical. He's a radical because he breaks away from the Catholic Church, but he's not siding with the peasant. He's not siding with like a revolution to topple anyone. He is more about attacking the Catholic Church. Calvin is a lot more radical in his ideas. Like predestination is like groundbreaking, because nobody ever taught in the Catholic Church that, or in any other reformers, that none of the things that you do matter. So a lot of people, then what's the point? What are we doing? All these sort of things. So it's a very radical idea. Any other questions? All right, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you all for joining tonight's stream, and to keep on, do we really need to know about Lutheran 95 Thesis, or should we know about more of his writing? Is addressed to the Christian nobility, liberty, and the Christian men? We use those in class. Yeah, I mean, those are good texts also to know. I mean, this is a quick review. I can't teach you all of the history of Luther. Yes, so you might want to know 95 Thesis is the basic one. You might want to know what he wrote, what he spoke about in other contexts. But you kind of like have to remember there's a couple of angles to Luther. There's nationalistic side that he writes about. There's what he writes for the nobles. So he's kind of like different in his writing. Depends who is he referring to. If he writes to religious people, if he's writing against revolution, or if he's writing for princesses. So yeah, I think those are good texts for you to know for the exam. And again, there's 7 periods that we have to study for the exam instead of 9. I think Reformation is a big one to study for, but again, it's just a gamble because we only have 1 DBQ, so we got to figure it out. If there's any other question. And again, we're just gambling, like we don't really know. We're just assuming based upon previous exam they can surprise us. But we know it's going to be an open textbook, so it's not necessarily about that you have to like pull up information in the last second. It's more about your skill, I think, will be about analysis of document. All right, thank you. You're welcome. All right, so thank you everyone for joining tonight's stream. I'll see you next week. The same time, we will go over, I think we have another stream coming about the French and the English Revolution, and we're going to do one about the Mannerism and Baroque art. These are 2 important things. All right, so thank you everyone for coming tonight. I will see you next week. Stay healthy, everyone.